What immediate steps should a veteran take if they walk out of that C&P exam and just know it went bad?
Well, there are a couple of different things to do depending on how it went bad. You've kind of rolled them all into one example, but if the examiner is examining for a physical problem and does not do a thorough exam, that's a problem. And it's going to be reflected in the report because he won't find things, or she won't find things, as the case may be. But the basic thing that you have to do with a bad C&P exam is complain that it was a bad C&P exam, preferably in writing. So what you want to do if you're a veteran is to send a written communication. You can put it on a VA form, you can put it in a letter, but you need to get it in writing and get it to the VA and simply list the problems with the exam.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for benefits, subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome to our podcast. Who are we? Well, I'm Francis Jackson. This is Christian Terrison. We're from Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in veterans' disability compensation benefits. And what's the show about? Well, today we're going to talk about C&P exams. And who is this show for? Well, it's for veterans, obviously, but it's also for people who care about veterans, families, relatives, friends, even those in the community who want to support our veterans. And today we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty details of C&P exams.
Yes. So, if you've worked with the disabled veteran population for any amount of time, you've heard the story. They get scheduled for a C&P exam, they go in, and the doctor barely knows who they are, takes 15 minutes, pokes a little bit, doesn't really listen to what they have to say, and then, fast forward a few weeks and you have a C&P report saying, oh, there's no problem, they have this great range of motion, or their symptoms are these minimal things. What immediate steps should a veteran take if they walk out of that C&P exam and just know it went bad?
Well, there are a couple of different things to do depending on how it went bad. You've kind of rolled them all into one example, but if the examiner is examining for a physical problem and does not do a thorough exam, that's a problem. And it's going to be reflected in the report because he won't find things, or she won't find things, as the case may be. But the basic thing that you have to do with a bad C&P exam is complain that it was a bad C&P exam, preferably in writing. So what you want to do if you're a veteran is to send a written communication. You can put it on a VA form, you can put it in a letter, but you need to get it in writing and get it to the VA and simply list the problems with the exam. Say, this is supposed to be an exam about my back. The doctor didn't do any range of motion testing. The doctor didn't seem to listen when I explained what happened to my back in the service. There are, depending on the particular claim and the particular circumstances of the exam, there are obviously different things you need to say. But the point is to get something to the VA, get it in your file, in writing, explaining every problem that you know of with the exam. Because if you don't complain about the exam, the VA is going to assume that the examiner did a perfectly good job. Not necessarily a perfect job, but a perfectly good job, and wrote a report that accurately reflects your condition. Unfortunately, the VA contracts these out to companies that are trying to make a profit. And the way they make a profit is to pay examiners less than the VA pays the company for the examination and report. So the company wants to get these done as cheaply as possible. Not surprisingly, that usually means they don't go out and hire the top expert in the field. In fact, they often hire physician's assistants and nurses rather than doctors. And when they hire doctors, they're often doctors who are retired or are just starting a practice or for some other reason are interested in these relatively low-paid projects. So what it amounts to is most of the time they don't get the cream of the crop for examiners, and they often get people who are not particularly well-trained or not particularly expert in the area in which they are doing the exam. So you get an advanced practice nurse who is good in family medicine, but really doesn't know a lot about orthopedics or pulmonology or whatever the particular specialty may be. So it's really important to document in the file the obvious problems with the exam. Now, I say the obvious problems with the exam because it's also important, and this is more the attorney's role than that of the veteran, but it's also important to make sure that when there are indications of bias or other problems in the way the examiner comes at the issue, that those get documented. For example, we had a case not too long ago where a gentleman had had an exam with a nurse practitioner. It was pretty obvious that the nurse practitioner, for whatever reasons, was not enthralled with this particular veteran, said some derogatory things in the original report, got the case remanded. They scheduled an exam with this same examiner. We put a letter in the file in advance of the exam saying, this is not a good idea. This examiner did not do a good job on the first exam. We really need an exam with someone else. They went ahead with the exam with the same examiner, but by doing that, I think it helped to support our position when we had to attack that exam, that this was, again, not a fair, objective, thorough examination, which is what the veteran is entitled to.
So is it fair to say that a bad outcome of a CMP exam, it's just a myth that's the end of the road for a claim?
That is a myth, but it has a basis in fact, as most myths do. What's going on when you have a bad CMP exam is if that's left unchallenged, it may well be the end of the road for that claim. So you have to do one of two things, or preferably both. One is to explain the problems with the exam, but the other is often to get your own exam. One of the things that we do a lot in veterans cases is to get private exams with specialized experts who are capable of understanding and explaining the nature of the problem. I've forgotten who said it, but someone once remarked that the mark of a true expert was the ability to explain an arcane topic to a fourth grader. It's important for people to understand the area of medicine that is applicable to the veteran in terms that are clear and simple enough that a non-medical, non-expert lay adjudicator at the VA can understand what is being said and how it applies to the claim and why it demonstrates that the veteran is entitled to prevail on the claim and get benefits.
I've read some of the reports from some of our expert CMP examiners, and now I'm terrified of the diesel fumes that come out of, non-road going vehicles, all the toxins and chemicals that are in there, all this stuff that just never, would have crossed my mind as a layperson, that has significant impact on disabling conditions.
It does. Unfortunately, we just don't think about that stuff, but think about being a mechanic and being around car exhaust all the time. The catalytic converters that we use now in ordinary automobiles reduce a lot of the emissions, but basically the stuff they're putting out is sulfuric acid in a gaseous form. It's not really good for you to breathe. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned diesel fumes. There's a lot of stuff that's just not good.
I was going to say, DOD's not putting catalytic converters on anything. Not at $1,200 a pop or whatever they're going for these days.
Yeah.
I guess, under what circumstances is it possible to request a reevaluation or a second CMP exam?
Well, I mean, the reality is you can always ask for another CMP. The problem is that because of the way VA has it structured now with these private examiners, the VA doesn't even necessarily have a lot of control over who the examiner will be and what their qualifications will be. So asking for another exam may well simply loop you back to the same person that you saw before, which is not really helpful. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we've found that it really is necessary to get a private exam and submit that. You can always ask for another exam. I mean, there's no barrier to asking. Whether or not you'll get it is a different question, and whether it'll be any better than the first is yet another question. But there is never a barrier to asking for a new exam.
So you talked a little bit about what veterans can do when they get out of a CMP exam that they think has gone wrong. How about when a veteran has a copy of the CMP exam report, the findings, and they see problems in it? What should they do then?
Same process. You have the veteran write a statement explaining, gee, this report says that I have this range of motion in my legs, but unfortunately, the examiner never tested the range of motion in my legs. So this probably is something that got pulled in by the word processing program from a previous report that he was writing over or something, but it doesn't reflect what happened in my exam. You know, that kind of thing is important to note.
And then what role does an attorney play if a veteran has representation? What role does the attorney play in addressing a negative CMP? Do any of the strategies you've discussed change, or
I think what changes is that rather than an angry letter from the veteran, you can have a more dispassionate and nuanced explanation of the difficulties with the exam, which may result in a more receptive attitude about it by the VA person who's dealing with it.
This one may be tricky to quantify with any specificity, but how often do you see negative CMP exams that you're able to successfully contest or overcome just in your practice?
Well, keep in mind that I personally now only do appeals at the court, so I don't see CMP exam results until years down the road usually. So I'm no longer on the front line in terms of challenging them. But certainly at the court level, I get to see a number of cases where there are bad CMP exams. Even at the court level, we can often demonstrate that it's an exam that should not have been relied on. Just let me give you an example. I had a case that we wrote the briefs on here, I don't know, 6 months, 12 months, sometime in the last year or so. And here are the facts. This young man was in a severe car accident, hospitalized for a week with a bad concussion. Not long after that, he went in the Navy. While he was in the Navy, after about a year and a half or so, he was in another bad accident, again hospitalized for over a week with another concussion. Shortly after that second event, he got in trouble in the Navy for saying racist things and ultimately was dismissed from the service. Now, one of the things that I've come to learn over the years working with psychologists and psychiatrists about folks with head injuries is that when you get a head injury, one of the things that it does is to affect what are called the executive functions in the brain. And some people would describe that as your filter. So all of us at times, I think, would like to say something mean and nasty to someone in the heat of the moment. You know, it's just a human reaction. You're angry at someone, you want to say something mean. But most of us have a significant level of executive function that lets us kind of bite our tongues and say, no, shouldn't say that, not going to say that, regardless of what it might have been you were going to say. When you get head injured, that filter is one of the things that is first to go in head injury cases. It's very hard for people who've been head injured to modulate their emotions and suppress angry statements. And so in the case of this particular gentleman in the Navy, he had this racist outburst, just dealing with an Afro-American sailor who felt was not treating him well, and he said some bad things. Now, I have no way of knowing whether or not this person would have said that thing but for the effects of these two concussions, but it's unlikely, I think. And the the psychologist that did the CMP exam never mentioned either concussion, never mentioned that this person obviously had some level of traumatic brain injury, never mentioned the impact of traumatic brain injuries on people's filter, if you will, or their verbal expression. Just completely blew by that. I couldn't believe it when I read this report. It was that bad. But that was the report. And so we've now sent the gentleman out to get a hopefully more thorough examination and an explanation of how all these pieces go together. But, that's kind of a higher level issue of bad exams. But it just, I think, illustrates the point that it is not always something you should take at face value when you read one of these exams. The examiners are not being compensated at a level where they are likely to do the best possible work in the field. And, some of them are perfectly competent and write perfectly good reports. Some of the reports are really pretty bad. And, it's sort of like playing roulette. You may hit the number, you may not. And you may get a good report, you may not. It's just a mixed bag. And all you can really do is read the report and look at whether there are real problems with it that need to be addressed.
We've touched on some of these already, but just in your experience, what are the most common issues or misunderstandings that arise during CMP exams? The greatest hits?
Well, the biggest ones, I think, are having the examiner ignore what the veteran says. I can't tell you how many times I've seen exams where the examiner literally doesn't talk about what the veteran explained about what happened in the service. He or she just says, I read the records. There's nothing in there about any kind of event where Jones hurt his left leg, and so there's no service connection for problems with his left leg. And, you go back and you say, well, did you talk to the examiner about what happened? Oh, yeah, I told him, and this is what happened. And it's not anywhere in the report. I mean, that's not the only kind of problem, but that is the single biggest problem that I see, is that the examiner literally ignores what they're told about the veteran's problem. It's just maddening.
Well, and the forms, as you were saying, many of the forms will have a checkbox for, does the veteran experience flare-ups of symptoms? If I had $1 for every time the no flare-ups checkbox was checked with a veteran with a decade of medical reports talking about flare-ups or exacerbations, I'd probably be retired now.
You're right. It's just, there are so many of these instances where the examiner just seems to have tunnel vision, looking at something and excluding everything else. It's just frustrating, but it happens.
I was going to say, it's even more frustrating cousin is when they check the box for no flare-ups. Then in the narrative part beneath, they say veteran describes having flare-ups about once a month, lasting 1 to 2 days. And then the regional office gets the report, sees the checkbox, says no flare-ups, and they evaluate it on whatever the range of motion was that day. And, you get service connection with a 0% rating.
Yeah. It happens. It is frustrating.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in to Victory Over VA. We appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe and check back next week.
See you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.